US Foreign Policy in Bush's Second Term. A 77-minute presentation held in the Collingwood Room at the Joint Services Command and Staff College Shrivenham on the 26th of October 2006, hosted by the Conflict Studies Research Centre. The speaker is Professor Michael Cox from the London School of Economics. Professor Michael Cox.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. On the way down, I was trying to think how to open the lecture, because if you always get the first 2 minutes right, the rest normally follows. It's like an interview, isn't it? You always know when the chap walks in the room and does the wrong thing in the first 30 seconds he's dead or she's dead in the water. So I hope the first 2 minutes get it right. And I want to start by just throwing out this argument that it's very rare to find consensus amongst academics. You may understand academics are like cats. We're very difficult to herd. It's very difficult to find consensus either amongst policymakers, academics, about American foreign policy in general and the Bush foreign policy in particular. Almost impossible. I can't remember a moment over the last few years. And certainly talking about American foreign policy, there's always been divisions and divides about US foreign policy, and not just under Bush. Some of you may remember Ronald Reagan. He was a deeply divisive president as well. Bill Clinton wasn't terribly popular in certain Republican circles. Jimmy Carter couldn't jog. And Richard Nixon, as you know, went out under a cloud, as they say, over Vietnam. So this is a very deeply divisive subject, and it's not surprising there are lots of different opinions about it. So as I say, it's not so surprising we don't find too much consensus either about American foreign policy or particularly about this particular administration over the last few years. Yet, that famous word yet or but, we are at one of those extraordinarily rare moments where there seems to be complete agreement about both. And if I can just summarize it rather simply, it is that US foreign policy is in trouble, and US foreign policy is in trouble because of Bush. I think if you were to go across the range of arguments from left to right to centrists to Europeans, amongst which I don't include the Brits, if you were to go to the United States itself, most important of all, what you will find now in this year, AD 206, is a general consensus on this argument. I mean, clearly there are some people out there who have always been anti-American, so you don't really bother to listen to what they say, because they'll always be anti-American under all circumstances. And of course this president himself has got more than his fair share of critics, and anything he does is bound to be criticised under any circumstances. But what I think is remarkable about the current conjuncture, to use that horrible word, is how much general agreement there is amongst friends and enemies, Americans, friends with the United States, and many others, about the problems currently confronting the US in the world, and the degree to which many of the problems that the US now currently faces are directly the result of the commander-in-chief, the man who has been a two-term president. Now, what evidence can I put forward to support these two assertions? Well, there's so much of it. I'll just be very, very brief about this. We are moving, for instance, to midterm elections in the United States over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Everybody is clear in their own minds that the last thing on earth the current administration wants to talk about is Iraq. They want to talk about Wall Street. They want to talk about gay marriage. They want to talk about values. They want to talk about all sorts of other things, but don't mention the war. The realization being that the current state of the war and public opinion about the war in the United States itself is not only deeply divisive, but is undermining this administration's credibility. There is absolutely no doubt about that. The V word has now entered, as I predicted it would about 2 years ago, the V word has also entered into the debate about the current situation in American foreign policy. And of course the V word in this situation is Vietnam. I remember giving a talk to a number of American business executives a couple of years ago, Republican to a man and a woman. It was great for a good old liberal like me to be in front of all these good old red Republicans. It was excellent. Good for me. Good for them. And when I said the V word, they said, no, nothing like that. No, this is not on the agenda. Now, I do think some of those analogies between Vietnam and Iraq are misleading. And there are many, many differences between Iraq and Vietnam, and that's self-evident. But nonetheless, the very fact that discourse about Vietnam has entered into the discussion, and by the President himself, not by his critics, I think is of extraordinary significance. It is quite clear that this administration, frankly, doesn't know what to do about Iraq. I can't see any signs that they know exactly what to do, because they know that staying in creates massive problems, getting out creates possibly even greater problems. They're caught between that proverbial rock and a very hard place. This, again, I think is generally agreed within and without the administration. If we look again at public opinion polls, and I very rarely do, but just for the sake of this argument, I'll use them just briefly. All American public opinion polls, although clearly it's a very deeply divided electorate, more so than I think it's been for a very, very long time. It probably as divided as it's ever been in the United States. All my visits there indicate a very deeply divided country on this issue. But public opinion polls show that Iraq and foreign policy generally is creating huge problems for this administration. I think another sign of the trouble in which US foreign policy is to see the debates now going on inside the Republican Party itself. I mean, of course the Democrats, if they could, will exploit Iraq and the state of play for this administration on all sorts of issues. That's what they're paid to do. I wish, frankly, they would do it better. That's my own feeling about it. But the real debate at the moment on foreign policy in the United States, I think, to some degree, is not just occurring between the two parties, but is also occurring within the parties itself. And I think it's very interesting to see the divide within the Republican Party on this. And in fact, if you like, we have really what I think is a very profound division now inside the Republican Party about the last few years, about the direction which US foreign policy has taken over the last few years and what to do about Iraq as a result of what has been done over the last few years. A couple of weeks ago, one of the great old loyalists of the Bush family, Consigliere, he was referred to, the former Secretary of State under George Bush Sr., Father Bush, James Baker, made it very clear that the current situation in Iraq is unbearable, cannot be sustained, and just toughing it out is no longer a strategy. And indeed, Baker, who of course learned his foreign policy under Nixon, and Nixon, of course, is most associated with the withdrawal from Vietnam, and how to get out of very difficult situations. And it's very interesting that language now of how to get out of an impossibly difficult situation is now being discussed in the highest levels inside what I call the Republican old guard, the old elite, if you like, the old traditional Republican Party, as opposed to the new boys on the block who have been occupying a high position over the last few years. And what is Baker saying? And I think representing a lot of wisdom, if you want to call it that, within the Republican old guard, the Republican establishment. They're saying it's not enough just to have a few friends around the world or talk to friends. Anybody can do that. The question is, how do you talk to enemies? How do you talk to enemies? And guess what? Who are the two enemies that are being suggested that the United States begin thinking about talking to, about how to work out an exit strategy, to use the phrase, is of course Syria and, most importantly, Iran. Historical analogies can always be extremely misleading, and again, I don't want to overplay the Iran-Vietnam analogy. It is misleading, but it is also there to be had. How did the United States get out of Vietnam? Effectively, by 1972, following the Paris peace negotiations, by talking to enemies. In those times, of course, talking to China, then under Mao Zedong, and talking to the Soviet Union. Again, one doesn't have to be that proverbial rocket scientist to say that some big and important discussions are taking place in the very high levels of the Republican Party. Another sign of the trouble in which I think US foreign policy is currently in, and by the way, this is of no great pleasure to me, let me make that clear, and I hope it becomes clear as I go along, that the very people who have been assumed to be central to the kind of drive of this administration, particularly over the Iraq war, the so-called neocons or the neoconservatives, it is quite clear that they are in extreme disarray. You know, those who formulated strategy, particularly over Iraq, who thought through the Iraq policy, particularly those who grouped themselves around the Vice President, Dick Cheney, the most powerful Vice President, by the way, in American history, and certainly in the 20th century. It is clear that those who, in a sense, provided the coherent argument, as it then appeared, in 2002 and 3 for the war, to get rid of Saddam and Iraq, democracy promotion within the region, that the intellectual coherence, in a sense, is dissolved. I won't use the analogy, the parallels of rats getting off sinking ships, but it is quite interesting to see those, in a sense, who have found that the old ways, that those ideas no longer make much sense. One important figure in this process of, in a sense, abandoning old neoconservative truths, of course, is a very influential political figure, a theoretical figure, Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama, of course, came up with that wonderful and absurd notion in 1989 of the end of history. He's been trading on that ever since. As they say in the academic world, don't write a good article, but do get a damn good title. Well, End of History really sold a lot of books, and certainly sold that article. And Frank Fukuyama, whom I happen to know a little bit, very nice man, dumb article, but very nice man. Nonetheless, he was a very central part of the neoconservative group, believing that the use of military power on the one hand, combined with this powerful argument about democracy promotion in the region, and those are the two component parts of this, would in a sense shake up the region and bring about a new constellation of forces within the region to deal with all the problems that the region had thrown up on 9/11, and that's essentially what the connection was. Frank Fukuyama has now not only abandoned the cause, the God has failed, he's also set up his own magazine, and indeed has recently written a book, in a sense saying, look, actually we were wrong. And there's very few people inside the Washington Beltway today who really any longer wanted to sign up to this original intellectual and strategic agenda, which was deeply influential within this administration. I'm not saying the whole of the administration was full of neoconservatives, it was not. President Bush himself, I don't think, was a neoconservative, but was clearly won over to those kinds of arguments, particularly following 9/11, and then which led us to the Iraq War. Other signs of the problems, I think, that U.S. foreign policy, and I can say this in front of you because many of you are wearing uniforms. I've actually counted up the numbers of retired generals in the United States who have now written their memoirs. And so it's quite interesting. They, of course, make sure they get their pensions first before they do this. Very wise. Indeed, good advice to all of you. But there's a number of interesting books, which have been written by what I call almost the Generals Against the War group. I'd almost call it now, We really didn't want to do this war in the first place, is the kind of argument which comes out. It was an unwise war. It was inflicted upon us by others. It was something we didn't want to do. And it was something, indeed, which in a sense ran very strongly counter to many of the things we had learned post-Vietnam anyway. Post-Vietnam, of course, had seen a strategic rethinking about the uses of American military power in the world, and particularly under Colin Powell, later, of course, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then Secretary of State in the first Bush administration. And many who have been trained in these new doctrines was this doctrine of caution. You use force for precise reasons against precise enemies, when there's precise necessity of doing so. You don't have wars of choice. This does not fall into the old Powell doctrine, and many of those, in a sense, trained within that framework, I think, have, in a sense, come out in retirement. It'd be very interesting one day, hopefully, but who knows, because his loyalty is very, very strong to this president and to his calling. It'd be very interesting to see what Colin Powell himself will one day say about the decision-making process which led to a war which was fundamentally opposed to everything he had been writing militarily and thinking militarily for 20 years. There's absolutely no way around thinking about how many lips he must have bitten to carry this through. Finally, of course, and I've only talked really of the domestic side of this, but maybe I'm over-elaborating a little bit, but clearly the United States, if in trouble at home, clearly is in trouble abroad. Again, I don't say this with any great pleasure, far from it, as I'll argue later on, because I want to think forward, not just backwards. But clearly the United States is in trouble abroad. Anti-Americanism, although I think it's always been around, has never been as widespread as it is now. And not in all countries. I met a friend from India, some colleagues from India recently, and they said, well, if you do public opinion polls in India, actually 71% of people in India are very pro-American. Very interesting. It's an uneven process. Clearly it's not all around the world, in all countries and in all places. And there's always been that kind of, we don't like the Americans, mainly because, they're powerful. Nobody likes people with power. Who wants to be number 3 or 4 or 5? There is always resentment against the hegemon. The hegemon should not think that they should be liked. That's why the British were so good at it. The British never like to be liked. It's a sign of weakness, you know. Maybe the American problem is, they want to be liked. I don't know. But the issue really for me is not that. It's to use the jargon. Plenty of hard power. Lots and lots of hard power. But the soft power is evaporating. It's the difference between power and authority. The moral leadership. The trust. All those issues, which are important for a country like the United States, because as we know, all great empires, and I conceive of the United States as being one, and I'm not fundamentally opposed to all empires, as you may also gather. All great empires may be based on military power, but they're also based on some notion of moral suasion and power and force and attraction. What we call now in the jargon soft power. And the Romans had a lot of soft power, so did the British Empire have a lot of soft power. The Soviet Union had no soft power, which is one of the reasons it was so damn weak. The United States has had a lot of soft power, moral authority, whatever you want to call it, for many, many years. Much of that, it seems to me, has evaporated. We may say, oh no, it hasn't, and it's only to do with Bush, and it's a criticism of President Bush, not of the United States. A lot of people still travel to the United States, but nonetheless, around the world, particularly amongst those who are the new influentials in the world. And you hear it at dinner tables, it's not just the chattering classes of North London, to which I happen to belong, thank goodness. It is not just the usual suspects list. It isn't that. It's friends and those. It's coming from places you would never have expected it. That's what I think is interesting. I think it's even of some interest that David Cameron, I nearly said the future leader of the Conservative Party. That's an interesting slip. But that David Cameron himself, in one recent speech, I think, raised this issue. One would still be a friend of the United States, but one should actually, a certain degree of independence from the United States. And this morning I see Max Hastings, hardly a Bolshevik. Max Hastings writing I can't remember which newspaper I got thrust. Daily Mail, that's right. Max Hastings writing this morning in the Daily Mail, berating, why did we send John Prescott to North Korea? Some may say, why doesn't he stay there? But why are we sending John Prescott to North Korea? And he then turns the argument right quite interestingly and says, look, at the very moment when British interests are being weakened by this connection with the United States. Now again, these are not the usual suspects of the normal, let's have a demonstration outside the LSE against the United States. That's the point I'm really trying to drive home here. So I think there is trouble, and it is deep and it is profound, and again, it is something which can't be avoided. And the reasons for it, I think, then bring me to the second part of what I want to say very briefly. That much of this is a very familiar story. One of the things I think you learn when you teach international relations, as long as I've done, is if things can go wrong, they will. And what you expect never turns out. And the only theory of international relations I now take seriously is that which says the unexpected is inevitable. And what you intend will never work out. It is the law of unintended consequences. And I think that, I don't think there's any, I'm a kind of cock-up theorist, not a conspiracy theorist. And I don't see any great conspiracies in this, but nonetheless, the story is a pretty familiar one. Going back to 2000 and then after the attack of 9/11, comparing the mood then, just post-2001 with the mood now, it's really quite remarkable shift. Immediately after September the 11th, a huge degree of moral solidarity with the United States. Dare I say, and even in France. Le Monde, we are all Americans now. Next day. Huge amount of moral support and solidarity. Article 5 was invoked for the very first time by NATO. And it was genuine. Now, I'm not saying all parts of the world, went out in sympathy with the United States. In some parts of the Middle East, I should imagine they were celebrating. Not all parts, but some parts. Iran, by the way, interestingly too, sent an immediate note of support for President Bush. And it's interesting to be reminded of that now. Where has that gone? Why has it happened? How has it happened? What's gone wrong? We're all adults, and we can hardly say it's gone right. Well, there's different ways of thinking about that. And different ways of constructing the story of what has, in my opinion, gone badly wrong. Was it to do with overconfidence? What the good old Greeks, my favourite writers on international relations still today, you must always read your Thucydides. It's still the best book on international relations, in my view, Peloponnesian War. Is it a classic case of hubris? believing you've got too much power. Overconfidence takes you in certain directions, and as Thucydides pointed out, what in the end brought down Athenian democracy was the famous Sicilian expedition. One thought one could do it. It looked weak, it looked doable, it looked easy, and it brought down Athenian democracy. It's the classic moment of hubris. Hubris is followed by the revenge of Nemesis. Perhaps we have much to learn from the past. I'm afraid this administration was not too much interested in those kinds of historical lessons. There was clearly a belief, and it wasn't just one shared by the Bush administration, that by the end of the 20th century, the United States was extremely powerful. Talk of decline, as it once had been in the 70s and 80s, had gone. That America, in a sense, sat atop the globe with a great number of assets upon which it could call. Military, economic, cultural, in many, many ways. Every single asset, it had it, and it had it in spades. Is it that what we're looking at here is the classic problem of the overconfident superpower? With no balancer in the world to hem it in the shape of the USSR, the balance of power effectively gone with the collapse of the Soviet Union. With a number of successes in the 1990s, it wasn't all a series of failures after all. I mean, the Gulf War I was hardly a failure. Was it that? And I think there's some part of it. It's not therefore a Bush issue. It is the question maybe of the problems confronting any hyperpower like the United States, that it believes that it has the capacity to do things. It is the danger of hubris. Lord Acton once said about power, simply that power corrupts, all power corrupts absolutely. Now, I'm not saying the United States was corrupted by too much power. I wouldn't put it strongly as that. But nonetheless, I think that kind of argument could be thrown in to draw it away from the usual stuff about Bush and all that. Secondly, one could argue, and here again one has to be modest, and indeed, I think very modest, how was one supposed to deal with 9/11? We'd never confronted anything like this before. It wasn't a state doing the attacking. The ideology wasn't one which we readily understood, or could understand, or certainly not empathise with. So one has to, in a sense, be modest in the face of the problems, and we should be today, still. Nonetheless, that all said, and understanding the difficulties which have been involved, and also recognising many of the successes which have been achieved since 9/11. It's not just been a black and bleak picture. Many successes have been achieved, many arrests have been made, much information has been gathered, and thus far at least, the United States at least alone has not been attacked again. And one has to say this has to do with some of the things that have been done by it. It's not a completely one-dimensional picture, but nonetheless, when the President announced a war on terror, I think a lot of people didn't quite know what it meant. And I think a lot of people still don't entirely. Certainly, even the announcement of the war itself created its own divisions. Sir Michael Howard, again, hardly, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Sir Michael Howard, in a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs, raised this question: what exactly does a war on terror actually mean? Why a war? What are the problems and implications of announcing such a thing? What does it mean conceptually? It's not like a war in any proper sense. Why legitimise the enemy through declaring a war? So there's a whole series of problems which have never quite gone away on that. Moreover, there was a feeling, and this goes back to my first point, that this administration was very much inclined, at first, to go it alone. Here the shadow of Kosovo, I think, hung over much of the American military decision-making process. You know the story much better than I. You can't fight wars by committee. NATO had been the committee which had fought the war over Kosovo. Many of the lessons had been learnt, and therefore this would be an American war, particularly first and foremost in Afghanistan. It's quite remarkable, again, to make the contrast between the kind of rhetoric which was employed in late 2001 about how to fight the war in 2001 and in Afghanistan, and by whom, to the fact that we have several thousand NATO troops on the ground in Afghanistan. This was not, again, how it was supposed to work out. This was supposed to be largely, not only, but largely an American-led war. This brings us to the question of how we got into Iraq. Again, we can open this into the Q&A. There's no point in me going back over this. From WMD to oil, from the Israel factor to the influence of a belief that one could remake the region. You can pick your argument about why the war. If you're one of the anti-war coalition, it was oil. if you want to be on the side of kind of making the argument for the war, I was sharing a platform yesterday with Philip Bobbitt, who's written on this. He basically thinks there were WMDs, and therefore it was an anti-proliferation war and was necessary, as did the Prime Minister then, although of course he said many different things since, through to issues about the role of Israel's influence on American foreign policy, much overdrawn in my view, through to the argument, which I think in the end makes most sense, frankly, that after 9/11 the US believed it had to remake the region, and that Iraq would be the first of several remakings of reforms within the region to recast the whole region. Whatever. What we do know is that nearly all of the experts on the region warned against the war. But you don't always listen to experts. Experts can go native. Many have. If you listen to some former British ambassadors, and I can be as indiscreet as possible, you know, I mean, I didn't know whether they're members of the British government or sort of apologists for the Saudi regime. You know, I mean, a lot of these guys do go very native, I think, you know. So you don't have to listen to them all. All their wisdom can add up to saying something to leave it alone. You know, and I do think there was a strong moral argument for the war, don't get me wrong. I think there was a very powerful moral argument for the war. I just don't think it was very wise. And many of the problems we are facing today may not be just because of the war, they may be because of the way the peace was made. And there's an argument to be made that the war was right, but the peace was done badly. The abolition of the Ba'ath Party, the abolition of the military, bringing in Bremen and all the other people, those with little experience. If you read the ways in which the US particularly thought about post-war Iraq, one comes away thinking, my God, this is just amazing. I mean, it's really a lot of planning was done for the peace, but it was done by the people who then had very little influence on what actually happened in Iraq. It's not true to say. I mean, I know a lot of people in the State Department who spent weeks and months planning the peace in Iraq, but the amount of influence they then had in Iraq after the war itself. So, was it a bad and unwise war in the first place? Or was it because the peace was made badly? I don't know. We can debate that as well, but the outcome is what we now see today. And I think that the other part of the argument, of course, is that within the administration, there were many. It's kind of an old international relations problem. If you're at the top of the pile, as the US clearly is, in international systemic terms, do you want to preserve the status quo? Because after all, it must work to your advantage. Or do you want to change it? It's one of the old dilemmas, you know. Do you want to keep things as they are? That's kind of the old British balance of power approach, you know. Keep things as they are, you know, better the world you have, because you know what it's like, rather than trying to change it. And I think this administration went through that kind of discussion. And I think within the administration, especially following the crisis of 9/11, and again, it's very difficult to underestimate the psychological shock of 9/11 on American thinking. I think America has gone through an enormous transformation psychologically because of 9/11. Much less so in Europe, I think. And I go to Brussels quite a lot, and it is a very different kind of response. But I think the reaction in the United States, we have to think more generally about the world and how to transform it. So you had a paradox of a great power who should theoretically been in favour of maintaining the status quo in the world, because it, broadly speaking, worked to their advantage, but an administration which seemed, particularly after 9/11, to be in favour of changing regimes, of altering domestic politics and domestic regimes in many parts of the world. And when President Bush made his very interesting and symbolically important speech in January 2002, his State of the Union speech on the axis of evil, clearly the combinations was pretty obvious why he used that speech. What he was really saying was that we will no longer accept the status quo in Iraq, regime change. We will no longer accept status quo in Iran. We will no longer accept the status quo on the Korean Peninsula. Regime change is our preferred and declared strategy. Now, why did they arrive at this conclusion of regime change? Rather than just containment, which was the old strategy for Iraq, maybe it was beginning to fall down, admittedly, and for North Korea and Iran. Because clearly there was an intellectual change and a shift, particularly post 9/11, in this direction. Now, one can try and sort out the arguments, try and unpack the arguments, but the way I would normally argue this is twofold. One, I think it's the old thing about learning the lessons of history. Everybody learns certain lessons of history. We all do. We all draw historical analogies. We always think backwards before we think forwards. If you remember, a large part of the Cold War against the Soviet Union was fought within the shadow of the history of the 1930s. appeasement against Germany, you mustn't appease the Soviet Union. That's the kind of simple historical lesson that a lot of people drew. The so-called Munich analogies. We mustn't have another Munich, because Munich is weakness, appeasement, that leads to further expansion, etc. You still hear that language quite strongly, and a lot of that has been drawn out. Many Munich analogies still being drawn out, I find, in some parts of the American administration. I think also it's the drawing of the lessons from President Reagan. The more I think about the Bush administration and its outlook on the world, the more I think it's the Reagan administration Part 2. It isn't Bush administration Part 2. That's the interesting thing. Indeed, the contrast between the first Bush administration and the second Bush is enormous, particularly over Iraq, especially over Iraq. The different kinds of conceptual ways of thinking about the world. The first Bush administration really was, we are the status quo power, and we'll work to manage this world as is. I suppose in theoretical terms called a realist foreign policy. Accepting the limits of what you can do, accepting the balances where they are. So if Iraq balances off Iran, they're two nasty and unpleasant, disgusting regimes. It doesn't matter. They balance each other and maintain a balance of power in the region. Don't go around changing them. The last thing on earth you want to do. This administration, the Bush Mark II, is not a Bush Mark II. Indeed, this Bush administration is really a very great rejection of the first Bush administration's thinking. But it's very like the Reagan administration. Why do I say that? Partly because many of the people in this administration learned many of their ideas and arguments, and won many of their ideas and arguments in the Reagan administration, against the Soviet Union. And what was the argument then? You can't just contain the Soviet Union. That was the Reagan argument, put it in its simplest form. It's more complicated than that when you actually look at the documents, as you always find. That's why you should always throw more international relations scholars into the archives for a year so they can learn something. Maybe they could learn one or two foreign languages as well, but that's another issue. Don't get me on my hobby horse. But it's clear that Reagan is a very complicated presidency. It's not as simple as it seems. But the way that this administration has drawn the lessons of the Reagan administration is that being tough, being morally clear, for us or against us, that moral clarity which President Reagan apparently brought to the Cold War in the early 80s, regime change. And I think many have drawn those kinds of... And Reagan, of course, is a hero. Is the hero for this administration, as he is indeed for many, many Republicans in the United States today. No bad thing. I think there are many things about President Reagan I actually rather like, particularly in his second term. And so here again, I think this is why this administration, has picked up on this argument of regime change. Plus, if you have the power to do it, you combine both of the lessons of history learned, the lessons of the Reagan administration, and you arrive at regime change. And we know where the problems are and where they are still today. Now, within this context, then one also has to say a couple of other things, because in a sense I'm simply trying to lay out my own stall as clearly and as straightforwardly as possible without some of the subtleties in the argument clearly get lost. But the thesis is a simple one. The US is in trouble. It may be in trouble because of the Bush administration. It may be in trouble because of the threats we confront today are more complex than ones we've ever faced before. It may not be his fault alone. There's a vast industry of why President Bush, is the most inept president, for the last 200 years. I'm not going to get involved in all that. I can conceive of the difficulties any serious policymaker would face after 9/11, and dealing with Iraq was not going to be an easy issue under any circumstances. But we are at least, I think, at a conjuncture where much of that early optimism, that can-do optimism, which is a very American thing, I think has run into some very, very deep problems in Iraq and in the world more generally. I think this is also occurring at another point where a series of new other issues are facing us and facing the United States, which I think add to this sense of where are we going? Raises more and more questions about the problems of the world we now live in. In some senses, just to put it another way, if you look at the kind of rhetoric of 2002 and 3, there was nothing America could not do. Indeed, some even began to talk of America as empire, this sort of notion that it had this great capacity. If you read all the materials today, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, it almost seems the United States has lost a capacity to do anything. Whether it's over Iraq, whether it's over what to do about Iran, whether it's over what to do about North Korea, what exactly leverage does this great superpower have? It almost seems like the giant with the feet of clay kind of argument, and creating new impulses. But to add to the kind of series of issues I've raised, three others strike me as ones which are not the fault of this administration, or indeed of the Bush administration or of the United States, but are three new challenges which have no easy answers, but which add, I think, to the general sense of a kind of crisis of self-confidence, if that's maybe the best way to put it. The first of these, and having come back from Beijing very recently, and therefore after 2 weeks of being in Beijing, in a highly privileged environment, speaking no Chinese, I can now claim myself to be a Chinese expert. But it is quite clear that China today poses a series of questions to which we have no easy answers. There is a new kid on the block. There is a new kid on... Indeed, even if we hadn't had a 9/11, if we hadn't had an Iraq war, we would be confronting what is going to be the great geostrategic conundrum of the next 50 years, which I think actually is probably not going to be international terrorism, which is going to be a background major problem all the time. It ain't going to go away for a very, very long time. But at the high level of big politics, of high politics, of classic state-to-state politics, the big one we'll be confronting and dealing with, and if we get it wrong, it may have implications far greater than getting Iraq wrong, is China. Now, as you know, when this administration came into office, the Bush administration came into office, Dr. Rice, a very formidable woman, a very formidable reputation intellectually, and a great political player inside the Republican Party, was quite clear before 2001, before September, that the new conjuncture in the world was going to be shaped by the US-China relationship. President Clinton had characterized the relationship with China in the 1990s as one of partnership. This administration now characterized the relationship as one of strategic competition. And in a way, that still summarizes, I think, those two parts, the two sides of the same coin, really. Immediately after September 2001, of course, previous potential rivals and problems became solutions. The war on terror began to make some new bedfellows. And one of the new bedfellows in the war on terror was China, who quickly signed up to the war on terror. And very interesting to see the way that the whole rhetoric of the administration has shifted, particularly over the last few years on China. Much more positive now. But still within the American debate there is this unanswered question, where's China going? Can it rise peacefully? What are the strategic implications of China for the Asia Pacific, and indeed for the world? A quick example in Africa. China is now one of the more forward advanced economic players in Africa. It goes into Africa. It's not a communist. I mean, the idea is communism is just absurd. You know. It goes into Africa and it says, we don't care what you do at home. If you want to torture people, that's fine. You know, you've got 2 million refugees in Darfur. Not our problem. Not my problem. I want oil. In other words, it undermines, frankly, everything the West has been doing for the last 15 years. Not by being aggressive or by putting forward an alternative ideology, but simply completely undermining all Western conditionalities on human rights, good governance, and all the rest of it. You know. Here's one simple example where China simply acting in its own interest, and who can blame it for doing that, becomes a problem. And you can see and feel this in the region. Second problem, which again is not one we anticipated, but one which is also adding to this sense of uncertainty about the future, is Russia. Now, I'm an old Sovietologist. You can probably tell old Sovietologists, they kind of shake a bit, because they studied this country lovingly or hatefully for years and years and years, and then the damn thing disappeared, Half of my friends went out of jobs, they suddenly became experts on Japan, and then that went down the Swanee in the 1990s as well, so that didn't help. And it was a wonderful period in the 1990s where all you could keep saying about Russia as well, they've got a drunken president, life expectancy for most men is going down, and it's in decline. And don't the Russians do decline well? They decline more rapidly than anybody's declined in history. It's the most extraordinary collapse of an empire to a single nation, and then the Russian all began to break up. These horrible wars, Chechnya and all the rest of it. Hold on. What's been happening over the last 5 years? Mr. Putin is not the greatest liberal democrat in history. He certainly doesn't drink as much as his predecessor, which would be very difficult. In fact, I don't think he drinks at all. You may notice he's highly self-confident. Why? Oil. Strategic raw materials. Russia now has a strategy. Russia has found a formula. It's called authoritarian democracy at home, sovereign democracy, damn, sovereign democracy at home, and building what I call a new state capitalism with all the resources. It's telling foreigners basically to bugger off. It's telling NGOs who've got any democratic pretensions of changing and transforming Russia internally to go away as quickly as possible. It is building up at least half a dozen, maybe 7 or 8 key strategic industries, raw material industries, which it will use for the next 15 to 20 years to build up a vast reservoir of economic power for then a diversification for the Russian economy. It will do effectively what Saudi Arabia hasn't done. Use major strategic assets for a domestic industrial renovation. Russia is back. Russia is no longer in decline. And Russia, again, like China, will pursue its own national interests. And this, I think, is also adding to another element. And something else has been thrown into the mix, which creates our levels of uncertainty about where it is going. This wasn't a problem 5 years ago. It wasn't a problem under Yeltsin, when all we could see was decline and drunkenness. Now we don't see it any longer. If you combine that then with the changing balance of economic power in the world caused by the rise of China, you then add that to the third factor. What appears to me, and many of you in this audience will know much more about the technicalities, it seems to me we're seeing a major problem, a breakdown, in the most important of our treaties, which the most important treaty, in my view, made in the whole of the Cold War was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1968. And it looks to me, and I'm sure it may look to some of you, but I may be too pessimistic on this, that the NPT, the fundamental building block of the non-proliferation regime, is under severe challenge. For all sorts of different reasons. It's not just to do with Iran, it's not just to do with North Korea, it's also to do with the relations between Pakistan and India, it is also to do with the major proliferator, Dr. A.T.Q. Khan. All sorts of things are happening in the proliferation world. We all know it's not very easy to make a nuclear weapon, certainly not to deliver it. Blowing a bomb is not the same as doing it. I'm not, sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for a deliverable capability by North Korea or anybody else. Nonetheless, the system seems to be in a process of decay. And we're not sure what we're going to put in its place. So to all the problems I've raised, I simply add those other 3, which I think also add. Now, maybe I've been overly pessimistic. Pessimism is fashionable amongst intellectuals, and I suppose I am one. After all, I live in Highgate, and I suppose Highgate's full of them. It's best to talk about crisis. There's lots of good things about the world, don't get me wrong. A lot of people's living standards are going up. 30 million people out of poverty in China. The US economy has not collapsed recently. Wall Street has just gone to 12,000. The overwhelming number of Americans are pretty content with the American system. In Europe, in spite of the many criticisms directed against it by both my American friends and by Europeans and Brits and others, Europe, I've been visiting there, it doesn't seem to be on its last legs either. There are many good parts, there's many good stories to tell. And indeed, there are many more positive things to say about US foreign policy. We could talk about it. Policies on all sorts of other areas of the world. US-European relations are in much better shape than they were a few years ago. US relations with India are much better than they were a few years ago. In fact, they're now extremely good. The US role in Africa is now much more active than it ever was before. And I applaud all this. So we can talk crisis, and maybe we can exaggerate it. And why mention the good news when there's so much bad news out there anyway? Moreover, I want to stress that I say none of what I've said in terms of a sense of schadenfreude. And indeed, the point I want to make is this, and this is really puts me to the future and brings me to my conclusion. I'm sorry, I've probably spoken for too long. My greatest worry of all, and I throw this out simply as forward thinking, what's the greater danger? An America which does too much or is overly confident, or an America which does too little and is not confident? And that seems to me the problem that everybody now faces on this question. It is easy to tear Bush apart, as many of my colleagues and my students do all the time. It is easy to point out the frailties and the problems and the contradictions of this administration's foreign policy, as we do. Academics, love doing that kind of thing. That's what we get paid for. We don't have to run countries, after all. All we have to do is criticize them. My major worry is really not where we are. My major worry is not just simply the question of where we are now, but where we might be in 3 or 4 years' time, or 5 or 6 years' time down the line. Will an American public, after Iraq, be willing to deploy and use force to go abroad again for many, many years? Will we have another Vietnam syndrome? If we do, we could be in trouble. We could be in trouble. Because the Iraq intervention has faced some major problems, none of which we have answers to. That doesn't mean to say that all interventions are wrong. Indeed, in the 1990s, there's a lot of people who are now most critical of the United States who were calling for the United States to be more interventionist, if you remember, earlier into former Yugoslavia. Many people who are critical of the United States now were those who were calling upon the United States in 1994 to go into Rwanda. You know, many of those who are critical of the United States today were the ones who were calling on an early intervention into Kosovo, without a UN resolution note. Nobody was thinking about putting it through the P5 in 1999, 2000 on Kosovo. No, bugger that. Let's get in there. Let's save people's lives. My worry, really, frankly, is this is my first big worry, is that after the very, very difficult experience that the US, and indeed its allies, have gone through over the whole issue on Iraq, then one could look forward to an America which is very, very reluctant into the future to do anything. The second problem, and again, this is as Colin Powell put it, you know, if you go into the shop and you knock over the vase, well, you own it. You own it, and we own Iraq. And we see the calls coming to get out of Iraq. You can see them coming from all sources. Hints of it, suggestions of it. It's clear. The wind is blowing in a certain direction at the moment over this. However, and this is not, as somebody who was, basically opposed to this war, with some reluctance, but opposed to this war, I find myself now in an extraordinarily difficult situation of being opposed to a war, but now being opposed to a rapid and easy withdrawal. Not because I think there's any easy solutions to staying in, simply because the consequence of withdrawal seems to me the consequence of that seem greater. So I would also worry in the short and medium term that public opinion could easily drive a decision in the United States, which may be good and make Americans feel much better, because after all you won't have the constant every night TV programs, but is it going to be good for the region, and what will be the outcomes of it? We've broken it, we own it, and I don't see there's any way out of that for a very long time. If that is the situation, then we've got to think through what that means. Thirdly, and finally, in spite of all the criticisms directed against the United States, the problems it faces, some of which I've raised here today, and many more we could talk about, and we could also talk about the other side, some of the good things, of course, which are important, equally important. You know, if we're blunt about it, and we've got to be blunt about it, we ain't got anybody else other than the United States. This is the point. I mean, I always say this to my students. I say, what would you prefer? What would you prefer? What's the deal without the US as the central player in the international system? Picking up bills, doing things you don't want to do, often doing them badly or wrongly, maybe under a bad leadership. We can talk about all that. We haven't got an alternative. If we had an alternative, we'd have found it by now. It isn't the European Union, let me reassure you. If you've got any worries about Europe balancing the United States over the next 2,000 years, you don't have to worry. I've been to Brussels, I know the people in Brussels. A, they don't want to do it, and B, they can't. We still live in a very unstable world, and a very uncertain world. I know it's a cliche. We do face these other issues. A rising China, a reassertive Russia, a proliferation regime which is in trouble. None of those are going to be resolved or dealt with seriously without the United States. You know, there's no way forward. There is no other alternative today. If they're not at the table being part of the solution, then effectively there is no solution. And I'm afraid I do come down. It's not because I think that everything the United States does is good, or because every single president it is elected is the best president I've ever liked. Nonetheless, those seem to be realities which we have to deal with. I conclude, however, on a more positive note, I think one of the great things about the United States, and this is one of the reasons I'm rather keen on the place, apart from the fact they keep letting me in, for the time being, I hope, is simply that one can see a real debate about these issues going on inside the US at the moment. I mean, for those who kind of have got this anti-American thing all the time, which annoys me beyond belief, it's a kind of acceptable form of racism as far as I can see. There is really now a vibrant debate going on in the US itself about where to go. Because I think most serious and mature adult Americans, not just the Bash America group on the one side, or Bush is always right group on the other side. There is a very serious debate now going on in the United States. And I think from my point of view, I think it's how we get engaged in that debate ourselves, which seems to me a contribution we can all make. Because after all, if the United States gets it wrong, as I think it's got a lot of things wrong actually over the last few years, then we're all in trouble. Thank you very much indeed.
Professor Cox was asked the following 7 questions. Question 1. Do you think the Americans will remain wedded to the idea of exporting liberal democracy, or will they become a bit more live and let live in their approach?
Yeah, great question. I think at the heart of much of America's relationship with the world is its own identity and its own values. And I think for many Americans, and I think Europeans find this hard to understand, I think there is a deep American tradition, which is different to the Europeans, about democracy. You saw it with Woodrow Wilson. You saw it with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Second World War. You saw it with Ronald Reagan. And you're seeing it with this administration. And you saw it, by the way, with the Clinton administration, who talked a lot about democracy promotion. And in that sense, President Bush does sit within an American tradition. He doesn't sit outside of it. He talks American to Americans. Very important. As indeed did President Clinton in a different kind of way. I mean that in a very, very precise way of talking American to American. Talks to American traditions. It's an American language. And thus, this idea of promotion of democracy, which I think has been really quite central to thinking about its Iraq strategy, it's at least one part of that, to think seriously about what's happening in Iraq, has to be taken very, very seriously. However, America is also a great power and has interests. And interests are not always served by promoting democracy. We know that. I mean, Saudi Arabia, let's be frank, is not run by a liberal democracy. It is run by a few families. And there are many relations that the United States has in the world today with regimes it doesn't particularly like, but it's regimes they are prepared to coexist with. China's one. I mean, having come back from China, I mean, China's a fantastically interesting place. My God, is it interesting. Is it a democracy? Well, not run by the Chinese Communist Party, not the last time I looked, There's debate going on there. I mean, within that framework, there's a lot of things happening, a lot of discussion going on. And more going on there than you'd think from the outward form. So it's prepared to live and let live with China, and occasionally making arguments against human rights. It's prepared to live and let live with Saudi Arabia. It's prepared to live and let live with Pakistan, because Pervez Musharraf is so important in the whole strategic balance within the region. So it combines both this attachment to democracy promotion, but also a strong realistic understanding that in many places it just won't work and you've got to wait. It may happen one day, but you can't make it the central focus of your foreign policy. The other problem, and this is the much bigger problem, I lived in Northern Ireland for several years, and as you can probably tell. And there was a very interesting moment, maybe one or two of you ever served over there. There was a very interesting moment at the time of the hunger strikers, and one of the hunger strikers was put up for election in west of the Bann somewhere. I can't remember which constituency over there. So one of the great Republican strongholds in the west of Northern Ireland. Owen Carroll, that was right. He was sitting inside the H blocks, for 15 or 20 years, of course, for a crime he never committed. Oh yeah. And I was never a gunman. And he was elected to the House of Commons. Of course, he would never have gone and sat in the House of Commons in a million years, And as The Economist wrote, he said, democracy is a fine thing as long as the right people are elected. And as we have seen in the Palestinian territories, you can have democracy, but actually some people will sometimes vote for the wrong people. In this case, Hamas. And many senior Americans I now talk to say, well, God, I can't say this publicly, but if we were to hold free and fair elections, say in Egypt, or let's just say Saudi Arabia, we have a sneaky suspicion the Islamists might win. So, as you can see, there are worries about this strategy now. Yeah. So it's a much more complicated situation now. That high rhetoric that democracy solves everything, I think that has been pushed to one side.
Question 2. Whether you accept there is a special relationship or otherwise, what do you think the implications are in terms of the impact on the British position in the world because of the American alliance with the UK? And secondly, in the detail, how do you think the Cameron-Clinton relationship could pan out in the future?
Well, I mean, the special relationship has been the one relationship which has been predicted to disappear for the last 25 years. Somehow or another it's still there. Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan, Clinton and Blair and Bush, remarkable. So something more than personality going on here. You know the deals. I mean, the modernization of our nuclear weapons will take place with the United States. Intelligence sharing is still very central. Very close economic integration, too, between the UK and US economies. The City of London wakes up one morning, and it could be in New York. New York wakes up in the City of London. Britain is the biggest foreign direct investor in the United States. And the United States puts 40% of its foreign direct investment in Europe in Britain. There's language, there's culture, and there's even a shared sense of history, even though they got it wrong in 1776. It goes on and on and on. There is. I don't get tearful about it, but it's there. And anybody who's kind of moved back and forth. Not all parts of the United States. South Boston, I wasn't very welcome there. Get out of here, you're Rory Brick. And, in Chicago, I was told to go away in certain terms. because of my English accent. So, it's complicated, but it's central. I mean, I still think it is. I mean, very interesting yesterday, just chairing this meeting at Chatham House. I'm sorry, I'm a terrible dropper of names. My wife keeps telling me not to do it. But it's very interesting. Jack Caravelli, he was the non-proliferation guy for the Clinton guys, under the Clinton administration. He didn't have to say it, but he started off and said, "It's wonderful to be back in Britain because I feel so at home here." I mean, and it's kind of not, he didn't just say it for the kind of sentimental bullshit. He just said it because, and if you go to the US, particularly this administration, and previous administration said the same thing, And we know that in the intelligence sharing, blah, blah, you see the top secret stuff I never do, but I'm told this, blah, 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 for eyes only, US, Australia, blah, 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 goes down the list. Not all of it. So it's very profound. It is very profound. And in an uncertain world, people will always look out for their friends and their mates. And Tony Blair has passed the loyalty test. Boy, has he passed the loyalty test. The way I look at this is one politician in particular has suffered the greatest because of this. It hasn't been President Chirac in France, whose opposition to the United States and mobilization of a coalition against the war won him support in France. It hasn't, in a sense, Bush has suffered, but and maybe we'll see this come out in the midterms. We may not see it come out in the election, but in the midterms possibly. But the one politician, serious large-scale politician in the world, he is a serious politician. I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with Blair, but there's lots of things to write about him, I think, is Blair. His authority has been undermined. Trust in the Blair administration has been undercut by the Iraq war. There's no way of getting around that. It's not just a question of, they got back into power and the Liberals are not the alternative, I think. But it's given that kind of possibility for an opening up of new British politics. Maybe that's a good thing. If you make mistakes in foreign policy, you pay the price. That's what a democracy is about. So I do think it is very special, and I think it will persist, and I see no long-term structural change in that. Whoever is in the Foreign Office, who's ever in the MOD, who's ever running British intelligence, MI6 or whatever, the close... And those relations also will be reinforced by the war on terror. The amount of sharing of information on this is critical. We've got to get it right. The alleged bombers who were going to blow up all those planes across the Atlantic, a lot of that came from intelligence sharing with the Germans, with the French, with the Americans. It was a very close, we face a common enemy and therefore our intelligence has to be shared. The worry is that it isn't shared enough probably at the moment. So all that I think remains part of the deal. Nonetheless, and this is the point you were really trying to get at, and I'll answer that now, there's no doubt that a kind of public opinion is, even in Britain, even in dear loyal old Britain, the unsinkable battleship, so to speak, even here there's been a kind of a shift of opinion on the US. If we look at those public opinion polls, they're not so far away from the European mainstream. They're not. So there is a shift, and you feel this, I say, my occasional bumping into members of the British establishment, there isn't an anti-Americanism, certainly not, but a certain sense that a greater distance. A distance, well, how do you, not distance? A certain sense in that one has to kind of play the relationship, manage the relationship, with the sense of not appearing to be too much, as if one is simply following and reading out the American script. I think that will have some significance. I also say, by the way, one final point, I don't think Blair was reading from Bush's script over this. I think Tony Blair read his own script throughout. I do think he read his own script throughout. So this notion of him as being a poodle, I utterly reject. But that's how it is perceived, and that perception of being too slavishly close to the United States has clearly had impact. And many sensitive Americans, even the Republican Party, understand this. And that maybe, not a distance, but some way of negotiating the relationship, so that it's a problematic one. I could give you a pat answer, but I don't think there is one existing.
Question 3. With the US elections coming up, there is a possibility that America could cut and run from Iraq and go into isolation. Because the UK is so close to Europe, if America did that, how would the UK be able to react or respond without America?
Well, the cut and run, I wasn't trying to overstate or understate. I simply say there is a tendency there now to cut and run. Because the situation doesn't look like it's going to get any better. American public opinion is now shifted decisively, and one would have to say permanently into a negative mode. The most important shaper of American public opinion is success. Not the original decision, but success. If Iraq had been successful, if many of the things claimed that would happen had happened, Bush would be now regarded as probably one of the great American presidents. I think he might be. One of the most far-seeing, brave, and courageous presidents. Failure, as we all know, is an orphan. Failure is an orphan. So I think there is a cut and run, and I think that public opinion is shaping this. All American foreign policy is in the end domestic politics as well. Congressmen want to get re-elected, and we'll look what happens to these midterms. If these midterms do shift the whole balance of political power within the two houses to the Democrats, which I have so far anticipated they may not in the Senate, but they might in the House, but if both houses were to go, House and the Senate, then I think this sends out a clear message. This sends out a clear message. And that the next president, whether it's John McCain or the senator from New York, it's no question to me, at least in the next 4-year term of whoever is in office, my own feeling is that there will be a withdrawal. My worries are this. How will it be seen, not just in UK-US terms? I mean, I think that's parochial, really. Sorry, not being unduly offensive, I hope, but I think that's parochial. The question is what it will be perceived at. First of all, it will be perceived as a defeat. There's no way to sell it. Nobody could sell what happened in Vietnam in 72 as anything other than defeat. You know, we carved out a deal in 72 at Paris. We thought we did a deal with the Russians and the Chinese. We bolstered the South Vietnamese regime for a while. We bombed the hell out of the North for a bit more. You know, and then it was we bought a decent interval, to use Henry Kissinger's phrase, for 3 years. And then the communists, as you remember, in those famous last minutes in spring of 1975, smashed through, and we saw what happened. So there's no way it's going to be regarded as anything other than a defeat. Defeat will, therefore, it seems to me, raise major questions about America's credibility. Credibility is seriously important if you're a major power. It would also raise really big questions about Americans' allies. Who's going to sign up to the next war with the United States? I mean, who will sign up to the next one if you can't run because public opinion then tells you you've got to get out, you know? This is why many of us had our real worries about going in the first place. But we're now. So it's going to raise a series of major, and not only, you know, in terms of the international situation, but I think a lot of people out there who are kind of holding fire at the moment will act with a greater degree of assertiveness if they think America is weak. Why is Iran acting in the way which it's not just he's got this nutcase anti-Semite running the place. He's not a nutcase either. He's actually reading the tea leaves. He's saying the Americans are in trouble. I'm going to take advantage of this. Why is Kim Jong-il, you know, he's actually taking advantage of the situation because he thinks the United States is, to use Mao Zedong's old phrase, is a paper tiger. You know, lots of people start coming out of the woodwork if they believe the United States is weak and it can't hack it. Yeah, I mean, I know this is all kind of blood and thunder stuff, and you don't need a civilian like me to kind of give military people advice. In fact, frankly, I wish it had been left to the military for the last 8 years. We may not be in the damn mess we're in at the moment. Too many damn civilians giving advice on how to fight wars. But I think that is going to be the problem. You know, I mean, it's not going to be a UK-US problem. I think there's a really much larger international issue involved here. So as I find myself in this kind of personally peculiar situation, as I think many people do, having huge, massive doubts about this war. But now having even maybe possibly greater, as many doubts at least, about the current pressures which are building up to pull out.
Question 4. What legacy will George Bush leave behind?
Well, it's difficult to know what anybody's legacy is going to be until you look 5, 10, 15 years down the line. I mean, Reagan's legacy lives on, you know, literally nearly 20 years since he left office. And you know, I mean, you know, so time will shape different perspectives on the legacies of anybody. I mean, you know, Churchill's legacy, you know, was immediately after the war. You couldn't say anything critical about Churchill. You know, now we're moving to a new generation of historians writing about Churchill, and you know, he may be a great political leader, but some of his military judgments are absolutely wacky. You know, I mean, everybody knows that. You know, thank God for Alan Brooke. You know, my good old mate from Northern Ireland, as I used to call him. I call him that, by the way, because I was a warden of a hall of residence in Queen's Belfast called Alan Brooke Hall. So you know, so you know, legacies are very difficult things. They can change and they can shift with intellectual fashion. I think this is the way I'd answer. I think amongst Republicans, I think there will be a very strong sense of a very positive view of Bush. You know, the true believers. I think amongst Democrats, he is the most hated president I can ever remember. And I think that tells us a lot, unfortunately, about the extremely divided character of America today. That's my reading of talking to friends, and I, by the way, have lots of Republican friends, and they admit to the same thing all the time. You know, the center has gone in the debates. If you look at it in Congress, hardly any Democrats vote with Republicans, hardly any Republicans vote with congressmen. You go out into the country, we talk of red states and blue states. What the hell is this? You know, whole states which are Republican forever and ever and ever, whole states which are What is this? This is not the United States of Roosevelt or Eisenhower when things changed around and, what is this all about? But it does point to the legacy. The legacy will be one of deep division. And the legacy which will be associated most with his name will obviously be Iraq. How Iraq works out, and at the moment all the signs are, I'm afraid, not good, let's be honest, that will also impede and impact on his legacy. Who knows? 10 years' time, Iraq may be a vibrant, flourishing liberal democracy, and then people say, yes, he was a great man who came under an extreme attack for those 10 years. But in the end, his ideas proved to be... so that's not a great answer to the question, because the question is such a difficult one. But that's my short and rather confused answer to that.
Question 5. With reference to your comments on the emergence of China, in your view, how will that be expressed in the future? Will it remain in the economic arena, or will it have a political expression beyond that? And also, once Russia finds its feet, how will Russia try to express itself internationally?
I've no objections to China trading in Africa. Who cares what I think? China has an absolutely perfect right to do what it wants to do in Africa, and it's doing it as a major economic player. It needs the raw materials, it needs the resources, and it's feeding a lot of prosperity in the world. Overall, China's a fundamentally benign economic actor in the world. It is the second engine of economic growth in the world today with the US. Thank God for China. We should get up every morning and say, well done, China. Keep those interest rates down in the United States. Keep buying American Treasury bonds. Keep buying raw materials in Africa. Keep going for oil wherever. They've got a perfect right to trade. I have no objection to that at all. Clearly, I think that's very, very important. We've got to adjust to this reality. And my only worry is, and this is my worry, and I know there's a lot of stuff about conditionality, and I think a lot of Western conditionality has been nonsense. You take the pain, but there will be no gain. That's been the Western line towards Africa for the last 10 years. You get rid of your subsidies, get rid of your housing, get rid of your health system, go through these tough bloody reforms. Oh, and by the way, at the end of the day, it's going to be really painful. And so most doctors from Ghana are ending up in Britain. This is part of the cost. So I can actually see there's been a backlash against conditionality. But some parts of conditionality, it seems to me, were right. On good governance, on human rights, and these kinds of things. And it's not just Darfur, but over a whole range of issues. And I do think these are significant. And this isn't Western imperialism wearing a human rights face. I think these are important points of where certain basic principles are right. we need good governance all over the world, not just in Africa, but we need good governance in Africa. We do need, human rights. We do need to see rule of law. We need to, I think, and my worry about China is it simply throws all that out the window, using the anti-conditionality rhetoric which is quite understandable, and just saying to these regimes, just get on with it. And I do think that is a problem, and I do feel that is a problem. Douglas Hurd was also talking about that recently, and I think I don't agree with Douglas Hurd on lots of things, but I think he made a very good point on that. On Russia, I think its impact, it's not going to be a new Cold War. Thinking about the future in terms of the past gets us nowhere. Putin is a very, very shrewd operator. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's consolidating domestic base at home. He's popular. He will be re-elected in Russia tomorrow again, both on his economic record and on his tough policies in Chechnya. Unfortunately, he's a war president too. He is a war president just as much as Bush has been a war president, and has played it quite subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, over Chechnya in the same way that the war on terror, in other words, has worked for Bush as it's worked to some degree for Putin. So he has a very clear political strategy. He will not go along with the normal kinds of liberal democratic frim-fram. He calls it sovereign democracy. But the key to all this is the raw materials strategies. They are consolidating these 4, 5, 6, 7 major areas of raw materials: aluminum, gas, oil. There'll be other areas in the steel industries and a number of key, huge industries which will be world beaters and world players. And this is critical because we're moving into a period now where oil, to take its obvious thing, becomes, as we know, always, ever since Churchill moved ships off coal into oil has been an internationally significant strategic commodity, not just an economic commodity. But Russia, therefore, the implications of it are huge. For instance, in terms of Europe, most mainland Western Europe, particularly Germany, now becomes increasingly dependent on Russian supplies. And Putin will not just look at this as an economic as an economic relationship. He'll want to use the politics of this and to gain political support. He clearly would like to see, I think, in a way, although he kind of keeps saying we live in a world dominated by the United States, in the end what Russia wants to see is a more balanced world, a multipolar world, to put it bluntly. We live in a unipolar world now, and clearly over 20 years this could mean, with the rise of China, the rise of Russia, particularly China, but also Russia, we could be moving into a much more multipolar kind of environment, it seems to me, over the next 20 years, of which Russia will be a part of it, in a way we couldn't have predicted 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, certainly not in the 1990s under Yeltsin. So it is a player. It is also a nuclear power, and it is clearly a member of the P5 on the Security Council. So it gives it, but with this new economic clout, and with a strategy, that I think, and with a strong domestic basis, this really does give Russia a much greater say, it seems to me, over the next 10 years. We overstated the Soviet threat in the Cold War, in my view. We then believed that there would be a diminishing role of Russia forever and ever and ever in the 1990s under dear old Yeltsin. And now I think we've got to get real again about Russia and start thinking what its role is going to be. And let's not get flimmy about it either. You know, Russia will pursue its national interest. There's lots of things with which it agrees with the West about. You know, all sorts of things. It's not going to be a new war or Cold War, but it's going to be a more problematic relationship.
Question 6. Have we heard the last of the expression, axis of evil?
Yes. That's it. I mean, I can give you that answer straight away. It's not used very often now. I mean, it was a mobilizing rhetoric, basically, to bring about the war against Iraq, largely. That's what the rhetoric was designed to do. And it served its purpose at the time. The decision had already been made, in my view, to go to war against Iraq by early 2002. We know this because so many books have come out of the US on this. I mean, Bob Woodward, having written one book, didn't have to write a second book. And bloody hell, he's got to write a third book. You know, he keeps revising himself. I mean, you know, how many books does he need to write, you know, to say the same thing over and over again? So we know the deal. Early 2002, they're going to go to war against Iraq, but you had, in a sense, had to provide partly a cover story for that, and Iran and North Korea were the cover story. And why it made a difference, however, in relation to Iran, we now know, and we've heard this from a number of senior journalists, Iran, after September 2001, was quite clear it wanted to open up a back channel to the United States. Iran was opening up a back channel to the US after September 2001. It had no love of Iraq, for obvious reasons. 1 million people died in the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. And the axis of evil speech, which then stuck Iran into the middle of all this, destroyed all that. So that rhetoric made a difference. Now, of course, it could be that other things being equal, it had been impossible to see a rapprochement with Iran. But it's interesting to see Baker now talking about that again.
Question 7. In the light of recent experiences, will America be more prepared to listen to organisations such as the UN and the European Union?
United Nations is no doubt. There's no doubt. It's gone through a terrible period. It's gone through an appalling period. US relations with it are very bad. They've got John Bolton as their ambassador to the UN. There's a lot of anti-UN feeling in the US and in the general public. You pick it up all the time. I'm teaching some American students at the moment in London from Dartmouth College. Wonderful students, but none of them seem to like the UN. You know, these are the people who should love the UN, but they don't. My only quick answer, however, is this. Love it, hate it, think it's corrupt, run by some dodgy people at certain levels, not Kofi Annan, who I think, by the way, is not dodgy at all. But what's the alternative? You know, where else? You know, take it away, and what else do we have? You know, it's easy to be anti-UN until you try and think of something in its, and you will think of something like it in its place. It is, in the end, the only fundamental international parliament we have. Weak and and divided though it happens to be. And I take a very tough and realistic view of the UN, but it's the best we've got, and therefore I think reform is the best way forward, although everybody's been talking about that. Back to old Europe, will it listen more? I think, in terms of Europe, the second Bush administration has listened a lot more in terms of Western Europe. I think they have listened a lot more. We got to the edge of the cliff in 2003 on the transatlantic relations. Everybody looked over and have now drawn back. And you can see this in Brussels. Solana is a very, very powerful Atlanticist. He doesn't believe in the French view of an independent Europe going it alone against NATO. Solana is a strong Atlanticist. There's a lot of Atlanticists in Brussels, and they're not just all working down at NATO. There's lots within the European Union who believe, the transatlantic relationship is still central to Europe's fortunes. And so there's been a lot of there's been a lot of listening. And even in France, I keep saying this, even in France you'll find that there's a much more mature view of the United States than sometimes you get from the French rhetoric. The old Gaullist rhetoric is there as part of French identity, but there's a much more mature relationship with the United States than you'd think from the rhetoric. So, and in the end, the United States, and I say this not because I overly focus on Europe and the US relationship, but, and this probably ought to be the last point, I suppose, who in the end is going to be America's most obvious partner in real terms? This is not saying anything about Australia and New Zealand, and because I go to Australia a lot, it's quite clear there's a very special relationship with Australia. Maybe less so with New Zealand, but it's not to say anything against Japan and the important strategic partnership with Japan. That's clearly a very important thing for the Pacific. Nor is it to say anything about the new emerging relationship, strategic partnership with India. It's not to say anything about that. It is simply to say that in the big world, of the big economic and political players. At the moment, the obvious main central partnership still seems to be that between the United States and Europe, old and new. And I think there's just too much at stake for that relationship to go wrong. And I think this is as true in Washington. You'll find a lot of people who bang on about the French, and you'll find a lot of people in Paris who bang on about the Americans. But they know at the end of the day they're part of the same team. They know at the end of the day they're part of the same team, whatever their different visions are of the world. And therefore, I think they will listen more. I certainly hope they do.
Professor Cox can be contacted by email at m.e.cox, spelt COX, @lse.ac.uk.